Becoming Undone is a podcast for those who dare bravely, risk mightily, and grow relentlessly. Join me, Toby Brooks, as I invite a new guest each week to examine how high achievers can transform from falling apart to falling into place. Y'all super excited about this one. It was probably around Christmas when Patrick Holcomb and I first connected. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Toby. Happy to be here.
You've got a fantastic story, and it definitely aligns with the vision for what this show is all about. You had audacious dreams and pursued those, chased those down in a way few humans in history ever have. And that fell short. And suddenly it turned into a big change. So I'm looking forward to digging into your story and gleaning some truths and some wisdom you learned along the way. But I always start at the beginning. What do you want to be growing up and why?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. So, when I was a kid, I was all about sports. And I think that is probably true for a lot of your guests and a lot of people in your life. Played basketball and baseball growing up. I wrestled for a couple years and I spent a good bit of time outdoors. I was always the kid who was playing outside. I don't know that I ever thought I would grow up to be a baseball player. I think even as a kid, there was a streak of realism there, and I realized I just wasn't good enough, but it didn't stop me from loving the game. And I can't even imagine how many hours I spent just sitting on the floor of my room, looking at baseball cards, memorizing stats, trading them with friends, watching the games on TV, listening on the radio with my dad. So my life was all about sports, but I like to crack a book too. And as I started getting into middle school, I started reading John Grisham. And I think at that point, I started thinking to myself, maybe there's a career for me as a lawyer someday. I had a lot of people tell me that I was able to talk fairly well and make a good argument here and there. So I started to envision that as my future at one point, and then life took me in a totally different direction, and frankly, I'm glad it did.
Yeah. We'll definitely dig into some details, but I certainly can connect. I grew up in the middle of nowhere and I didn't have a neighborhood to play with. I grew up on a farm. We had this big barn with a sloped roof, and I would throw a tennis ball up and it'd roll down and I'd catch it, basically playing catch with yourself. So those early dreams of baseball, we certainly share in common. So from there, you ended up in the Marine Corps and retired in October 2021. So talk me through how you go from those early dreams of baseball stardom or maybe even success as a high powered lawyer to a career in the service.
Yeah, it was an interesting ride. It really was. I never envisioned myself joining the service. It was never something that I really thought about. But as I was getting to the end of high school, I started looking at the landscape and saying, what is it that I want to do? And my grades weren't fantastic. So a 4 year university was out of my reach. There was the community or junior college route, sure. But I think a part of me knew that I wasn't really ready for that. And it sounds weird to hear a rebellious kid say, maybe I needed a little discipline, but I think I might have. And I was approached by a recruiter. And then somewhere down the road, I decided to give that recruiter a call. And we had a great conversation. And soon I was signing on the dotted line, and my parents were signing right along with me saying, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, for sure. So an exciting pivot. Where was home for you? Where did you grow up prior to starting your career in the Marine Corps?
So I was born in the Bay Area in Concord, and we moved around quite a bit when I was a kid. My dad worked for AAA insurance company, and every time he would get promoted, that would be a move for the family. So we moved around a bunch when I was young, and then we found our way to Santa Rosa, about an hour north of San Francisco, and that was home for a long time, and still feels like home today. So I went to Pioneer High School, graduated in 2001. And then a month later, I was on a plane and then on a bus and then on some yellow footsteps at MCRD San Diego.
Well, it sounds like you were accustomed to that military life, even though your dad wasn't in the military with the copious amounts of moves. So, probably the meat of your story comes from this unique pursuit, the 7 and 7, you refer to it as. And that started while you were in the Marine Corps. Am I correct?
It did. It did.
Yeah. Where did the genesis for this idea come from? And how did you get started? Talk us through what the 7 and 7 is and how you got started on that pursuit.
Okay. So let me tackle that first. What is the 7 and 7? The 7 and 7 was my idea to run a marathon and climb the highest mountain on every continent, including Antarctica. So this started back in 2011 when I was deployed to Afghanistan. And it was a long deployment. And I was working hard. The hours were just unimaginable. And frankly, I was tired. And when you're deployed, you have a lot of time to examine your life, examine yourself, and think about what it is that you really want. So I did that. I did a lot of that. And as I was nearing the end of that deployment, one of my buddies said, "Hey, we should do something fun when we get back." And I heard him out. And his idea was, we're going to fly to Africa and we're going to climb Kilimanjaro. And I didn't know much about Kilimanjaro, but I said, "Jeff, let's go do it." And that's sort of where the story began.
That's exciting. So, all continents, including Antarctica, you mentioned in your email to me that you
Mhm.
had run a marathon on Antarctica. I can't imagine there are a lot of folks that have done that. And so, climbing a mountain's one thing physiologically. It's a
Mhm.
challenge for our skeletal, our neuromuscular system, our cardiovascular system. Running a marathon is a much different challenge. I'm curious to know maybe which of the two you found to be the biggest challenge and why.
It's tough. Honestly, I would say the mountains are harder because as you get into these taller, bigger mountains, it takes more and more time. And you're up there for weeks at a time. And that altitude, those harsh conditions, they start to take a toll. They really do. And with the lack of oxygen, you are not the same person or athlete that you are at sea level. And different people respond to it different ways too. Altitude sickness is a thing and it can hit anyone at any time, regardless of your fitness. And when it hits, there's not much you can do about it and it hurts.
Yeah. And the marathon, suck as it might, it's a confined space of suck where you gut it out and do it a day and then you're done, right?
Yes and no. Race day is one day, absolutely. And I always used to feel such an incredible sense of release as I stood there at the starting line, just waiting to begin, because I knew that the hard work was behind me. And the hard work is the training. And that is months and countless hours of training that goes into running a fast marathon. And when I say fast, I'm not Olympic qualifying fast by any means, but for an average human being, I'm pretty fast.
Yeah. You'd also mentioned in the run up to the show that you were able to successfully complete all 7 marathons on different continents and you were pursuing the mountains. And at some point, this wild and crazy dream started to look like a reality. I'm curious though, the time commitment, the finances that it would take in order to be able to do this. Talk me through what that pursuit of this dream meant for you as a person working in a job.
Yeah, so it's an idea that grew over time. I started with Kilimanjaro, and then that same year, I had a goal of running my first marathon. And I had tried training a couple different times and had injuries, and I wasn't able to make it happen. But then in 2012, right before my 30th birthday, I got that first one under my belt. And I was like, man, this is amazing. I felt good about it. I ran like a 3:36. And at that point, I was like, I think sub three is probably within reach someday. So I set a sort of goal to start training for that. But after that first marathon, the next one that I did was in Beijing. It was on the Great Wall. So outside of Beijing, but on the Great Wall of China. And as I did that trip, I met other people who were pursuing this goal of running a marathon on every continent. And that kind of inspired me. So the way that I was able to keep doing the marathons in the mountains was that in my job as a Marine stationed in Japan at the time, there were a lot of targets of opportunity. And so I took them. I went down to Australia on a number of occasions for work, and I ran the Sydney Marathon while I was there, and I climbed the highest mountain in Australia, which honestly isn't all that high, but I was able to do that as part of my job with just a few days of leave taken. So part of the way that I was able to do this was by leveraging my job, which was fantastic in that regard.
Yeah, no doubt. As you're talking, I'm thinking about how things like the internet and then social media allow us to connect with like-minded folks that are few and far between in our normal day-to-day circles. It's not like you're going to run to the grocery store and bump into somebody else that's seeking this
Mhm.
goal. But what kind of support or network did you build over time? You kind of alluded to that on the marathon side, but what did that mean for you in this pursuit? Did you feel like that was a really critical part to your continued pursuit of this dream?
I felt like it was. You form these friendships that are just amazing with people that you can look up to. You look at their achievements. Wow, I want to be on that level. And yeah, it definitely inspires you to continue reaching, continue pushing. There are also able to coach you when you're down too, because they've been through the same things. And that support network is important because it doesn't always go the way that you want it to. You don't always find your way to the summit. You don't always run the time that you're trying to. Sometimes you get hurt and you don't make it to the start of the race at all. And when those things happen, it's important to have people that you can lean on.
So you're in pursuit of this goal and checking off the boxes. There's basically I don't know if there's a hand scratch list of 7 marathons you want to run and 7 peaks you have to summit, but you're on Denali and you're in the process of checking this box and then it doesn't go according to plan. So talk me through what that experience was like and mentally the gymnastics you went through and the realization that this one's not going to happen.
It was hard. I still look back on that time and in a way, I'm still processing some of these feelings because I did spend years chasing this overarching goal. But Denali, we did that in May of 2021. And there were a lot of warning signs for quite a while beforehand that my body was just not going to be able to do this forever. I had shoulder surgery the November before that. I already knew that there were problems with my hip. My back was so bad that there were days where I had to roll out of bed and crawl across the room to turn off my alarm. But I kept pushing it because it mattered to me. So I was able to get myself together to go and do Denali. And I wasn't entirely comfortable. I felt like I was able to accomplish the task and I got very close. And there were some things on summit day that happened that were outside of my control. And that's ultimately what prevented me from getting to the summit. But even then, as I came back down to the camp at 17, the highest camp there, I knew that I probably wasn't coming back
Mm.
because I had a hip surgery in front of me. And we had been on that mountain for 23 days at that point, which is a
Wow.
serious commitment. And I just didn't know if I had it in me anymore. And yeah, you talk about the death of a dream. That was it right there. I really had some feelings to confront and process. And it took some time. It really did.
One of the concepts in one of the classes I recently took is that of sunk cost. And
Mm,
I wasn't familiar with it. And sunk cost would say that you don't throw good money after bad. If you recognize that something you're trying to build in a business is not going to be successful, you don't continue to pursue it. You pivot right away and you run away from it. And as I'm approaching that, I'm like, that's not how I'm wired. As a human being,
mhm.
I can't look at this just quantitatively. And I'm assuming based on your reaction that you didn't just calculate the costs and think, this is it, I'm out of this. You recognize that you had invested a significant portion of your life, finances, your identity is wrapped up in this pursuit. You wanted to become the third person, maybe in history, that's ever done this. So, in those days, those weeks, those months that followed, talk me through the thought process of what giving up on this dream meant for you as a human.
You hit on some really key points there. It was about time and money that I had sunk into it, yes, but perhaps more so about my identity and who I had become. These goals had been formative in ways that I probably didn't think they would be going in or even realize at the time, but they had very much shaped me. And it was difficult to even imagine walking away from something that I had spent so much time working toward and dreaming about. And yeah, there was something of a grieving process that I had to go through. And it was at a time where I was going through massive transitions because at this point, I'm coming up on my Marine Corps retirement and walking away from a career that I had invested 20 plus years in. So there were a lot of different things happening for me at the same time. And yeah, it was tough to process that change. But I think what helped me was that while I knew that one dream had died, I also recognized an opportunity. I'd already planned to take time off after I left the Marine Corps to go and finish the climbing endeavors. And I knew that rarely do you get the opportunity to just take a huge chunk of time and pursue a passion project and do something meaningful. So that's when I really started thinking about this book that I had been conceptualizing for a few years already but didn't really yet have the courage to commit to writing.
Yeah. Before we get there, we'll definitely dig into the book. I want to go back and maybe even drill down on that moment. And you said you're on the mountain for 23 days.
Mm.
And at some point, ultimately, that go no go decision gets made.
Mhm.
And I've had guests on this show that talk about these big transitions in their life, Olympic athletes who knew in an instant their career was over, or entrepreneurs who recognize that the business they've worked their whole life to build is suddenly gone. And they had a shut the light off in the office for one last time moment, or looking back on something and thinking what might have been. Was there a specific moment like that for you on Denali, or were you more in the midst of your pain and your suffering and in the kind of the tyranny of the now as we talk about?
The moment that I decided to turn around on summit day, I knew. And I had time to think about it when I got back to the tent, and I'd cleaned myself up and had a little bit of time to catch my breath, both literally and in a figurative sense. Yeah, I knew. And it was something that I really, though, had to take time to process. And the feelings were different at different times. Sometimes I was relieved, sometimes I was disappointed. It was more so disappointment than anything else. But sometimes there was relief too, because I knew that I wasn't going to have to continue putting my body through the things that I had been putting my body through. And that had taken a toll over time, really had.
Yeah. And I think that's we're really talking about the mental toll that this took, but ultimately this was a physical decision. It wasn't like I'm not feeling like I can climb the summit. You're not physically able. So what specifically were you dealing with physically? And now you've got to get back down the mountain in the midst of this pain and suffering.
Yeah. So here's the reason that I turned around, a couple different reasons. When we began Summit Day, there was a very long line of people because there had been bad weather for the 2 or 3 days before that. So people were piled up waiting for their shot. My rope team started at the very back of that line. So there's a section initially called the Audubon where you're transitioning across the mountain and you're in the shade. The sun is not up yet. It is very cold. And it was supposed to take about 90 minutes. Because of this backlog of people, it took twice that. And I started getting very cold. And by the time we finished that and I was able to take a short break, I realized when I took off my gloves briefly that I had the beginnings of frostbite on fingers on both hands. And I was just extremely cold and I was having trouble warming up. And while other members of my overall group had a chance to rest, to get some food in them, to just sit and absorb some of that sun up there, we had to move very quickly. So my rope team got about 5 minutes and not enough time to really recuperate and get ready for the next stage. So I went on for two more legs after that, but I couldn't get the hands warm. And then the core started getting cold too. And I just couldn't keep and stay warm. And I began to worry. And the worry was about myself, yes. But when you're in that circumstance, you can't just think about yourself. You have to think about the team because once you begin to suffer, you become a liability. And it's not just you. You know, everybody on that rope with you is connected, not just by the rope, but your circumstances are connected and your fortunes are connected. And it takes one small mistake to put everybody into danger. So I made what I thought then and what I believe now to be the right decision. And I turned around.
Yeah.
And then it was just the process of getting down the mountain, which was still difficult. But even in the moment, I knew it was the right call.
Right. So the title of this show, You're Undone. You're probably at different phases or in different moments coming apart. You feel like I gave it my best effort and I fell short. But then what's behind starts to dim and what's in front begins to grow ever clearer. So talk me through how this dream of this kid that read John Grisham at one point decides he's gonna invest and become an author.
A part of me had always envisioned a day where I would write a book. I think I talked about it for the first time when I was a kid. And then I quieted that voice for a very long time. And I didn't really mention it to anybody. I never wrote fiction. The first bit of fiction that I ever wrote was the prologue for the book itself. First time. I'd done a great deal of writing professionally up to that point, but I'd never written fiction before. But for me, it started with an idea. And that idea was formed back in October of 2014. Bay Area guy, I'm a Giants fan. And the 2014 World Series was the Giants against the Royals, went all the way to game 7. Some of you might remember the year of Madison Bumgarner. He just dominated throughout the playoffs, put the team on his back, took them all the way to game 7 of the World Series, and then came in on short rest and closed it out. And it was incredible for me, not just as a baseball fan, but as a human being, because I was at the same time going through something very difficult in my life. Someone very close to me who I love very much was ill, and the outcome was uncertain. And as the Giants were making that playoff run, I was experiencing both things simultaneously. And as I watched the team rush onto the field when they closed out that game 7 and won the championship, I knew in that moment that I had experienced something different and special, this full spectrum of human emotion. And it stuck with me. And it was that moment that planted the seed that eventually grew into the premise of this book about fathers and sons and lives intertwined with baseball.
Yeah, that's tremendous. I certainly recognize that sometimes dreams are deferred and they just ruminate in our head and we don't either have the opportunity or sometimes it's an inner voice that tells us we're not good enough. We've talked at length on this show about imposter syndrome and how do I have what it takes to be an author? And questioning your own preparation. It's almost human nature to discredit your own abilities. So you've got an idea for a book, but an idea for a book does not create a book. And
No, it
there's the
doesn't.
writing, there are logistics associated with do I get an editor? Do I contact an agent? Do I find a publisher? So once you finally decided that, okay, this dream is over, I'm moving to this next goal, what were the next action steps for you?
People laugh when I tell them what the next step was. And I'm not kidding when I say that I drove to Barnes and Noble and I bought a book, and it was called Writing Your Novel from Start to Finish. And that book was the first real concrete step that I took, because I read it cover to cover a couple times. I highlighted, I took notes, I researched things that I didn't quite understand. And I began to understand the mechanics of writing a novel, which is important. And then it became a process of, okay, I have this idea. I know where the book starts and I know where it ends. So I started to imagine the characters, do character sketches, do a plot arc, and then start filling in the middle chapters of this book. And that took a lot of time. And really, I didn't have a full structure for what it was going to look like until I was about a third of the way through. But once I had it, it pretty much stayed consistent, even through the second, third, and fourth drafts.
Mhm. So I teach a writing for publication course, and one of my what I feel is the most important lessons I can share with our PhD students is the importance of consistency in your writing and how whether it's for me, like I've got a basketball jersey on underneath here. When I know I'm gonna write, I wear a basketball jersey. Sometimes I'll wear a sweatband for crying out loud. The music has to be what the music is. The lighting has to be what the
Mhm,
lighting is. The desk is what the desk is. I've identified what puts me in that zone. And that maybe
yes.
that's old stuff from the
Mhm,
athletic career, but it's stupid. I know it's stupid to put on a basketball jersey to write, but if it helps, it's what I'm gonna do. It's what's gonna
yeah.
facilitate my
I
success.
do not think that is stupid at all. I think that anyone who has the dream, the ambition to write needs to figure out what works for them. And once they understand what those situations look like, what they need to do to create that atmosphere where they can be productive, replicate it every day until it becomes routine. And it's really routine that makes writers successful. Being able to go in there day in and day out and just create. And some days you're on and some days you're not. I believe that you have a rule, don't you? Something written on a Post-it note, 2 crappy
Two
pages
crappy
every day.
pages a day. That's
There you
right.
go. There you go. And sometimes you greatly exceed that, and sometimes you scratch to get your 2. But for me, I had to create that structure and build that routine. And it was me with a laptop on the couch, usually in sweatpants, just nice and comfortable where I could just let the ideas flow.
Yeah. Bonus points. That tells me you've listened to at least an episode or two in the past. So appreciate that. A fist bump for those that are listening. So you create this book,
Mhm.
and we've talked about how vulnerable it is to create something, especially when it's outside your comfort zone. Let's face it, you're this tough marathoner, mountain climbing Marine. We don't tend to think of them as novelists. Forgive me if I'm speaking things that aren't true. Talk me through what that meant. It's one thing to write it, it's another to put out there that I've written a novel and I'm going to release this thing and I've got a plan in place that I'm going to sell this. So, what was that like for you?
I think there are two different answers to this question. So the first one is what it took to actually become vulnerable enough to write well. That in itself was a transition. That was me unlocking a place inside that had not been open for quite a while. The job that I had did not leave a lot of room for emotion. It was very analytical and logic based. So I had to rediscover a side of myself that I hadn't really been feeding for a long time. So that was a challenge because you have to be able to feel those emotions if you want to infuse your characters with those emotions. And if you can't do that, if you can't succeed in writing deep characters with complex emotions, you're never going to touch a reader in the way that you want to. And if you're not doing that, then what's the point? What are you
Yeah.
really after? So that's the first part. The second part is having the courage to take this work, this passion project, this book that you believe in and put it out there in the world. And man, that's hard too, because you know that not everyone is going to be a fan. It's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. There's going to be critics and they're going to say some harsh things. And I haven't really felt the full brunt of that yet, but I'm sure once the book is out there, I will. I'm hoping though that the positive feedback is greater than that negative feedback. And I'm also going into it with thick skin. I know that not everyone appreciates the same things. And in my heart, I know that I wrote a compelling story and that it has the potential to touch people in a special way. And Toby, man, that's really what it's all about.
That is. Being vulnerable is one of the bravest things we can do. I've discovered that. It's false bravado to say that bravery is just being indifferent to fear. Right? It is literally staring your fear right in the eyes and going ahead and doing it anyway. And whether that's producing a book or a podcast or whatever that idea knocking around in the insides of your cranium is, there's a reason you're terrified to do it. And oftentimes it's self-preservation. And it takes a lot of courage and strength to overcome that. It wasn't like you were a professional 7 and 7er. You had a big transition in the midst of this as well. You're a career Marine and you retire from there as well. Would you say that transition was easier because of what you had already processed and dealt with in this other transition in your life, or was that difficult as well?
I was going through all of it at the same time. And I think I was fortunate in that by writing the book, I was able to put off the career transition. And it really gave me time to prepare myself for that next step. So by the time I had completed a third draft and started shopping the book to agents, I knew that I was not only ready, but eager to go back to work. Because I look at you and your life and career, you're probably like me in that you're a guy who can't just sit around. So I
Yeah.
was ready to make that transition. But even then, it was challenging. You know, you think, man, I'm an accomplished guy. I have skills, I have degrees. I'm sure everybody's just going to be clamoring to hire me. It doesn't work that way. And it did take some time for me, not just to find a job, but to find the right job. But once I did, I took all those things that I had learned over the years as a Marine and I applied them and I hit the ground running.
Yeah. It's wonderful. So you've made this transition. What do your days look like today?
So I do have a full-time job and that does take up a lot of my time and it's one that I enjoy. But when I come home from that, I do spend a lot of time doing tasks related to the book. As a fellow author, I think you understand how much work could go into that. And yeah, it does take a lot of time and effort. It can be a little demoralizing sometimes, but there are also so many joys that go along with it too. And that's what I'm trying to focus on. I'm really
Yeah.
trying to have a sense of gratitude as I go through this process.
Love it. I absolutely love it. I think my own naivety in creating made me think that the worst thing that could happen was for someone to be critical of my work. And over the years, I think I've changed that definition. I almost I would prefer someone to be critical of it as opposed to completely unmoved by it. I don't want someone to listen to my podcast and be like, "Yeah, that's just another podcast." Take a position, like love it or hate it. At least I
Right.
know you've consumed it. And writing a book is no different. I can certainly see where we don't welcome criticisms, but at the same time, the last thing I want is for copies of my book to just sit on the shelf and it not to make the impact because you've poured your heart, you've poured years of your life into this and years before that in the pre-production.
Mhm.
And for that to fall flat and with no response is to me is more tragic than it. I hope it evokes some sort of emotion in my mind. How would you say you're different as a result of this process that you've been through, the 7 and 7 and your career in the Marine Corps and now as a soon to be published author? What lessons did you learn along the way that you think will carry through for the rest of your life?
I cannot even begin to convey how thankful I am for the career that I had. Becoming and being a United States Marine shaped me. I was fortunate enough to have some great leaders along the way. I had some bad ones too, and sometimes you learn more from the bad ones than the good ones. But I had some great leaders along the way who shaped and molded me. I had the opportunity to teach, coach, and mentor young men and women who are out there today still serving as fantastic Marines or out in the world doing so many other things. So that was wonderful. Writing the book has changed me in that it unlocked that other side of me. And it was a side that was dormant for a long time, but it's a side that I think will make me much more capable and successful and well rounded in whatever comes next. And from the running and climbing, it really taught me to push myself. And I think that's important in whatever you do. But you don't get to the points that I got to without being able to push through a little pain and find the growth that exists on the other side of it. And that's meaningful. And I'm appreciative of those experiences and how they shaped me.
Absolutely. It's a remarkable tale, and I say tale, it's not fiction. This was your life. This happened. You willed that into existence, and that is commendable. It's one thing to persevere, but you were doing it at a high level. Your marathon times, I don't know what your Antarctica marathon time was, but those were impressive numbers for someone that's not a professional athlete. And it's clear that this was a critical part. You don't get those numbers just rolling out of bed. That is part of a premeditated, planned out process. Sounds like you've had some time to process the loss of this one goal and the development of this next, but it wasn't easy. And there were some dark days from the sounds of it. If you could go back in time and impart some wisdom to younger Patrick before
Mhm.
this entire journey started, before that friend made that innocuous comment, "Hey, let's go
Mhm.
climb Kilimanjaro," what would you tell yourself?
Enjoy the ride. I think that's the most important thing. You can't make everything about the summit or the finish line. It's about the journey. And I knew that, but sometimes I lost sight of that. And as I've had time to reflect on these experiences, what I remember most are the people along the way, the people that I did these things with, the relationships that I formed. So staying in the moment is something that I would tell my younger self and to really enjoy the ride, be present, and also in the other areas of my life too. Don't let it become all consuming and overwhelming. Just be present. Enjoy the people in your life, enjoy your family, because those experiences aren't always going to be there for you to have. And sometimes I overlook that and I take it for granted. So that would be my advice to younger me.
That is sage wisdom, and it's so powerful. Time after time, I've heard high achievers lament the fact that in the midst of what they were accomplishing, they didn't take just a moment to just take it in. I remember Michael Jordan curled over the NBA championship trophy and his dad had passed away and he finally took a moment to feel what it meant to achieve that figurative summit. And so for you, these are literal summits. And I love the fact you say finish lines and summits because that's literally what you were doing. That's what you were crossing and achieving. And that is so powerful that you are living out and actually achieving things. So often we think of our mountains as figurative, and that promotion is a mountain that I'm going to scale. A book I always talk about is David Brooks's The Second Mountain, where he talks about success is what we do early and significance is what we do later. And you alluded to that. Your legacy is what you poured into those people who are still serving in the Marine Corps. And I think
Yeah.
that's so powerful. We're getting close here. I love music and the emotions that it can frequently represent. If we were to watch a montage of your life, what song would you pick to play in the background and why?
Oh man, that is a tough question. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know. Man, you stumped me at the end, Toby. You stumped
As a
me.
marathoner, I have to
Mhm,
think you've probably got a running playlist at least. I don't, my phone doesn't work in the cold. So
mhm.
the climbing stuff, do you have audio that's
Okay, so
playing?
I'm about to unleash what I call my inner weirdo here, and I'm gonna tell you, I don't usually listen to music when I run. Part of the benefit of running for me was the mental health side of it, because I had hours and hours to just think through problems, to work through challenges. I was often listening to my own inner voice as I was running and not listening to music. So
Wow.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to disappoint you and your fans out there. Say that I just don't know, Toby. I just don't know.
Wow. I can't think of anything much more abusive than running a marathon with no songs. That just tells me that you're a little bit more of a sadomasochist than I thought because
Yeah, that's so. So, man, I'm learning about
Ah,
myself here.
yeah, for sure. What
Mhm.
for Patrick Holcomb is yet undone?
So some would expect that I would say the 7 and 7, and that's one answer, but I think for me that is done. I don't think I'm going back to that. If I would say anything at this point is undone, it's probably me. I remember many years ago, I went to a leadership conference that was being hosted at Notre Dame. And there was a speaker, and he was an author, and I can't remember his name or the name of the book. And I've tried over the years to find it. But I do remember one thing that he said: you are either green and growing or ripe and rotting. There's no middle ground and no in between. And that stuck with me. And I've repeated it more times than I could count to my Marines over the years. And that's how I look at myself in my life, is that I'm still green and growing. So yeah, Toby, if anything's undone, it's me. I'm a work in progress. There's always room for growth, and I'm committed to getting there.
I love it. That is fantastic. And I also love I have a similar story. I went to a Division III school for one semester. I knew I was going to have to transfer out when I got there. I was going to play basketball, and we had chapel, and we had a speaker. And I've gone back and tried to figure out who said it, but he gave this whole talk on the immutable sense of ought, and he talked about the voice in our head that tells us what we ought to do, and
Mhm.
every day presents an opportunity to either abide by that sense of ought or to deny that sense of awe. And to your point, the green and growing for me, I know I need to eat right. I know I need to move my body. I know I need to read and grow. And that's what I ought to do. And sometimes I'm better at that than others, but I love the green and growing or ripe and rotting. Like the
Mhm.
thought of complacency for a high achiever is it's almost like a death sentence. Like I don't
Terrifying.
want to be a year older next year. I want to be a year better. And
I love it.
at some point, that will catch up with all of us. But Patrick, an absolutely inspirational story. I'm so thankful that you took the time to share with us. Looking forward to the book coming out. That said, how can listeners connect with your work and where can they find where the seams meet?
So the book is going to be released on March 29th. And I have an event here in San Diego, California on April 2nd at Warwick's Bookstore, one up in Santa Rosa on April 12th. On the 29th, though, you'll be able to find it on Barnes& and Noble, Amazon, anywhere else that you buy books. And I encourage you to do so.
Awesome. I will also drop your socials. I think you're on LinkedIn and maybe Instagram. I think we crossed
Instagram,
paths.
Forever Giant 2014. And then my author website is authorpatrickholcomb.com.
All right. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have you on, and I'm
Yeah, the
thankful
pleasure
that.
was mine, Toby. I'm a fan of the show, and it's really cool to come and be a part of it.
Thanks so much. Last little bit, always stitch this in. Just state your name and say, and I am undone.
My name is Patrick Holcomb, and I am undone.
Awesome. That was great.